Hey everybody, welcome to Drive Thru Review 635. Today I'm going to talk about one game, but it's actually two games. This is the new adventure game series from Kosmos. Here you can see The Dungeon, and then this one here is called Monochrome Incorporated. And these are the first of a series of games that are going to be coming out over the next couple of months leading into the end of the year. Now I know they have at least two more planned after these two. I don't know what the names of those are. I don't know what the theme of them is, but what this game system is about, this adventure game system, is sort of like the Exit game or the Unlock game series, but it's really devoid of, there's still some puzzles, but they're not nearly as many puzzles. It's not puzzle driven. You're not, in the case of the Exit game, destroying any of the components. There's no components destroyed here. And it's more of a kind of a choose your own adventure game with some cards and some interlocking light puzzle elements. You play from like 1 to 4 players. And obviously, as you can see, these are set in different themes. We've got a dungeon idea here, which is a little bit more of a fantasy theme. And then you have here like a Monochrome Incorporated, which I would say is maybe more like a modern day espionage with a little bit of sci-fi thrown into it. So let's take a look at sort of how a game plays. Now the problem with this is, of course, is I don't want to spoil anything. But to give you sort of a sense, each of the games has multiple different endings. I'll have to check. I think each game has at least 3 or 4 different endings that you can sort of reveal. Well, I'll show you a little bit of how the mechanics of that work. So you can play it through multiple times. And just kind of a spoiler, small spoiler for the review, not of the game, is I really liked one of them and I didn't really care for the other. And I kind of want to play one or the other again, actually, where I didn't actually have that inclination. Like if I play an Unlock or an Exit game, when we finish it, I don't really go, oh, I'd like to play that again. Now there's some caveats to wanting to play these again, but I'll explain that a little bit in the review. So let's talk a little bit about how these work. And I'll try not to spoil really anything about the game, and I'll come back and tell you what I really think about it. Okay, so I decided to go ahead and just set up components for both of the games. Because the games play really similar, but there's also some notable differences. And as I said kind of in the preamble, I really liked one of the games, and I really didn't really have a good experience with one of the others. So let's just talk a little bit about the games here. So here you can see I have the adventure book for The Dungeon. And then also we have here the adventure book for Monochrome Inc. And in here you'll find many entries like a Tales of the Arabian Nights or Choose Your Own Adventure book. And there'll be certain things that tell you to go to an exact number, 771 or 351 and stuff like that. So similar to the Exit game, sometimes you'll be combining items to sort of trigger a certain number in here. And there's actually an app that is going to be out that will actually recite for you these entries. Now that's not available now, but I quite expect that would be the way that I would want to play this game instead of reciting it out, because you can see some of these are relatively involved paragraphs, so there's a lot of reading and stuff, but of course you can pass the book around and take turns reading. But I think it would be kind of a nice experience if the voiceover acting was well executed. Then I think that would be a really cool experience. Now, you can see a couple of differences here in the games. On the left-hand side, you have Monochrome Inc. On the right-hand side, you have The Dungeon. Well, you can see here in The Dungeon, you start off in this particular cell here, locked in. You have some amnesia and stuff like that. And then you have to figure out to get out. And then, you go on kind of an adventure, a little bit of an escapade, figuring out what happened to you, why were you in here and stuff. And that would be you and all of these little meeples here. So it comes with little meeples that you can move around and you can take actions on these particular things. So if you want to look at this, windowed bar thing here or the skeleton, you go and read that entry. And then if you get items that interact with those, you'll kind of combine the numbers on there with the item number. But I don't really want to show you the items because that's really the most spoilery part of the game. Now you also have here these little avatar cards, and you have this in both games. So you see the blue player here is named Aref, and Haruka is the green player, Cassandra is yellow, and so on. Whereas in Monochrome Incorporated, you have these folks. You have John, who's the bootlegger, and this person actually begins the game with a card. All of these begin the game with sort of like a handicap, which is going to, in the case of this particular game, raise the alarm level. So you can see here when it says read entry 999 as soon as you hit alarm level 5. So different things are going to kind of trigger the alarm. But what's going to happen as well is you can see in this case the numbers have little icons next to them. So one person might have the handicap. If they take this action here, then that's going to automatically raise the alarm because they have a handicap of that particular type, or somebody else might have this one, and over the course of the game you might get more handicaps. And so this one also has the concept of an elevator. You can see we laid out A, B, C, and D because this elevator here has A, B, C, and D. So you have to take the elevator up to get to certain areas. And then over the course of the game, you might change out the elevator. You also have here, instead of the alarm, in the dungeon game, you have this adventure one. I'll show you the first one because this is what you say at the beginning. It says, you want nothing more to escape this dark dungeon. Find the exit. Be on your guard though. Who knows what else is hidden within these walls. And so as you go through the game, your sort of objective will change. And that's sort of what's going on here with the alarm system, but not really. You also have these other cards, in this case the M deck, which will change. And both of these have an E deck. So these are the different endings that you can get to. And so what's going to happen is you're going to have various endings, and then the last ending card is going to kind of give you your score, which I'm not going to show you because if you know what you're scoring, that will also spoil something. And so you have here the ending deck here, the E deck for that particular game. And like I said, you have the different items, cards, and then I'll try to do something without spoiling here. Here, this is innocuous. This is a glass bottle. It's an empty glass bottle. It's number 30. You may or may not find that on the course of your adventure. If you were to say, like, want to combine this one with another item, you'll combine the two numbers together. Let's say I had a 30 and a 60. So you always take the smaller number first, so you would have 3060. So you would look up entry 3060 in the correct adventuring book. But if you were to combine it with, let's say, a particular location, say I want to combine the glass bottle with, I don't know, whatever's under the bed. So you would look up 36601. And if you have an entry, then obviously you did something possibly correct. Maybe you did something bad and something bad will happen. But then you'll read that entry and do what it says. If you look it up and there's no entry, then you've kind of like wasted your action for the turn. So the two games play out relatively similar, where you can sort of move from one specific location to another, these different numbers, and then do an action, either combining two item cards or something else related to the game, or combining the item card with the location. Now in this one though, you can only kind of move. This is the confusing thing about this game, which is why I didn't like it. It's not really confusing, it's just sort of cumbersome. So if you're on this level here, then you can move to another level. You have to get on the elevator, move up there, and then you reveal this if it's not been revealed, and then you can move in and out of there. And then you can trade cards with people on the same level as you, which includes anybody that decided to stay in the elevator. But it also says like you have to move in this game, which sort of makes sense because you're sort of under the gun and under pressure with the alarm. So it kind of forces you to interact with things you don't want to interact with, because you're like, well, if I interact with this other thing again, then I'm wasting my turn. I already know what that says. But maybe I'm interacting with a special thing and that's making me trigger the alarm faster, which I don't want to do either, because maybe we're one tick away from the alarm going off. It's sort of like, it makes sense thematically, but it feels sort of, I don't know, I didn't like that part of it. So we'll talk about more of that in the review. And you kind of force stuff around. And so the other thing it says, you have to trade, if you have item cards for each character here, as you collect items, the character will get like the empty bottle and so on. And so you have to either trade items with somebody on the same level as you. So like, let's say this one was here on the revealed room. Then I could trade items with them and then move and do my action, or I can move and do my action and then trade items. Whereas in the dungeon game, it's very free form. And as you sort of build out, I'm not going to show any more of these, but you're going to build this huge kind of dungeon, then you can just move anywhere you want in the whole dungeon. You just go wherever you want and you can trade items whenever you want. It just makes it flow and free form, and it's like, okay, it's your turn, Billy. Here, you take this card from me, and then you go and you combine these cards with that. So you almost in this game could just have a collective pool of items. But don't do that, because there are certain things in here that are going to trigger based on who actually controls the item at a time. So you still want to kind of keep track of who has what and trade things, but it's just so much more looser and freer. And it doesn't really get in the way of the story. Whereas in this one, you're kind of juggling certain things Sometimes it makes thematic sense. I don't want to spoil too much, but you can kind of imagine like you're covert and you're kind of trying to sneak through this office building. And so you should be able to just kind of send stuff across. Yeah, I don't know. But I think I still think they could have geared some of the items that you find in here to be more general so that it wouldn't matter, and then you can kind of be a little bit more easygoing with it. So anyway, that's kind of my mechanical issue with this, is it sort of felt hamstrung in terms of like, okay, you got to move here and then you can go to another thing, and you can't just seem to like jump around, and then you've got to call the elevator and go, and it's like, just say you can move wherever you want. And then, you know, because sometimes you don't want to get off the elevator and stuff. I don't know. I think they could have just did it a different way. This is compared to playing this, which is such an easygoing thing. You were just more about the discoveries and the involvement there. I'll talk more about that in the review part. Now, the only other difference here is in this dungeon one, you take a certain number of health points. You basically take this deck of health points and divide it amongst the number of players. So if you only have 2 players, each of them will have 6. And if you have 4 players, they'll be less, and so on. And these actually work with your score a little bit. So as you take damage, what you do is you take health that's active like this and flip it over, and you've lost that. So once you run out of health points like this, then if you were to take damage, then somebody else has to flip theirs over. And then once everybody's is gray, and you start to take damage, then you start to actually lose health points, and you get rid of the cards permanently, because there's ways to heal health points that you have, but once you start to lose them, then you lost them forever. And what this actually does is, it's not really like a life and death thing. What it does is you score the game in 3 different rounds, and you get some extra bonus points for having the sort of activated health amongst all your party members. And that's actually a very just smooth, streamlined way of kind of using health to, you want to get a good score, and you don't have to really worry too much about it, living or dying, and the kind of the mechanics of that. It still leans into the story aspect of it. And there's other ways to score points, which I don't want to spoil for this. But that's really kind of the gist of the 2 games. You kind of move around. On your turn, you move, and sometimes you move somewhat strangely, but not really in this game. And then you interact with something, or in this case, you have to interact with something. Like, everything is sort of forced in this to kind of push you and pressure you to, raising the alarm. And this one is a little bit more easygoing, but certain things are gonna, kind of come after you a little bit more as you kind of drive through it. So you're still kind of being pushed through this one. It's just not like ham-fistedly enforcing you to do it. And of course, you're reading through the adventures, making decisions there and keeping track of certain things. There's, these cards can be a whole mess of things. They're not necessarily items. They could be people that you found or discovered, or other little kind of things like that, that there might be little puzzles and stuff like that involved in here. It's not always just like combining 2 numbers and figuring out what goes together. There will be certain puzzles and things like that you're like, oh, I've got a number now out of the puzzle that I've sort of solved, and then you're going to go read that entry, and then that'll kind of, unlock certain things. So anyway, that's kind of the gist. So we'll go back to my talking head there, and then we'll talk a little bit about more of my thoughts on it. So that is the adventure games from Kosmos. And if you couldn't tell from the walkthrough bit of it, I really enjoyed the dungeon one, and I didn't really care for the monochrome ink one. Before we jump into that part of it, let's talk about kind of the 3 pillars of reviews. And the first thing I'll talk about is player count. The game plays 1 to 4 players. I don't think, it's probably not that big a deal player count wise, but I think that's going to change. Well, once the app comes out, I don't think it'll matter, because then the app will be kind of narrating. Whereas if you have 4 players, it can be kind of tedious to read all of the paragraphs and stuff like that after a while, because the playtime is going to take you a couple of hours. I'm not sure what the box actually says on it, but I think you're looking at, to play through a full adventure, probably about an hour and a half to 2 hours, kind of depending how things go for you. Because it's not a quick little 1 hour thing, at least in my experience. I don't think you want it to be. I don't think you want like a quick get in and get out. There is some stuff to chew on here in terms of narrative and sort of figuring out and talking about the adventure and like what's going on and stuff. It's not like, let's burn through this. Like, that's not the experience I want to have with it. But reading the stuff out loud gets a little tedious after a while. Not too bad, like not to the point where I'm like, let me give that a negative review or something because of that. I just think some folks are not going to really appreciate that. And if you have just like 2 people, you're either going to each be doing a lot of reading, Or 4, it's just going to take a little bit longer because you're going to be passing the book around and reading, or you're like waiting for somebody to read. Maybe somebody's like, hogging the book and they want to do all the reading or something. So you have that kind of reading dynamic, which isn't always the best. But once the app comes out and you have the narration, which I can't speak to because it doesn't exist yet, I kind of expect the player count not to matter, because you could either be sitting there by yourself and listening to it, or having 4 people listen to it. And in that case, you've got kind of 4 more kind of brains and heads involved, just sort of like adding to the story and the discussion and the puzzle part of it, which isn't a lot. But then as far as the playtime, I kind of, talk about that. It's about an hour and a half, 2 hours has been my experience to play through that. And so that's just kind of what the ballpark of my experience has been. I think maybe if you soloed it or something, you were a speed reader, then maybe you could get through it quicker. But I don't really know what that's like. So so that's kind of the player count and the play time. And as far as like what other games is this like, I kind of talked about that earlier with the exit games, the unlock games. It's in that kind of vein. It's a choose your own adventure game. So it's an exit without as many puzzles, more story leaning and stuff like that. And it doesn't really have like one solution. Although the exits and the unlocks recently don't really have one solution. They have like kind of a main solution with other sort of side quests, if you will. And these do have that. They do have kind of the concept of side quests. And that kind of comes into the scoring, which I can't really talk about in detail, but there's other things you can be doing, like, oh, let's do that because that's going to get our score up. It's going to kind of not really take away, but it's going to sort of deviate the path as far as, the main story, the main goal of, whatever your objective is. So that's kind of what it is. It's kind of a choose your own adventure, kind of baked in with some of those kind of exit room or exit game style mechanics, but definitely more on the story side of it. And I'm kind of glad I had a chance to play 2 different versions of the system. Because, I got a chance to play one that I really liked, which was the dungeon. So that was, satisfying and rewarding. And I didn't just play Monochrome Inc. and I would just be like, oh, I hate this system, because I didn't really like that game. And it's not really the system. It's just kind of that interpretation of the system. And I talked a little bit of detail about that in the walkthrough, but I'll kind of cover that again here. But the way that you were sort of like forced to do stuff in Monochrome Inc., because in that one you're breaking into a corporation. It's kind of corporate espionage, and so you should be sort of pressured and chased and forced to kind of trigger the alarm. Otherwise, you're just kind of avoid it and get around it. So it makes sense to me why it is that way, and there could be that some other people would really kind of play with that. But you can also kind of get around it anyway after a while. Though it kind of forces you, you're just triggering the alarm, but the alarm doesn't really do anything to progress the story. That's not really a spoiler. It kind of does, but it sort of just is it's like a score thing kind of stuff, but it doesn't really when the first alarm happens, this is going to happen. You're like, oh, nothing happened. I was like, okay. I was kind of hoping the alarm would trigger something, and then this other thing would kind of come in. You would add a little something to the story, and it really, really didn't. Whereas in the dungeon, that's all kind of driven through the hit points, and so sometimes it's a little different though, because you're visibly decreasing your score, sure, but then instead of, it's almost like the reverse. Okay, so in the Monochrome one, you're like, oh, I have to do this because there's nothing else to do and nothing's going to improve the story, and I'm going to trigger the alarm and blah, blah, blah. And you just feel like you're forced to do it. Where in the dungeon one, you sort of have stuff happen to you. So you're going along and then it'll say, oh, well, who did this? Was it Cassandra or Auric or whatever the names are? And oh, you were doing this one? Or you can gather everybody up and decide to do one. And they kind of give you a general trait. This one is I can't remember what the names are, but the listener, this one's the strong one. And this one's the attentive one. This one's the strong one. So you can sort of make a ballpark kind of role-playing guess. So it feels a little bit more organic and natural in that case, and you don't really know what's going to happen. It kind of reminded me of that game from Fantasy Flight Games. Forgetting the name of it. It came out a couple of years ago, last year, and I kind of like that one. Oh my gosh, it was set in Tyranoth. Nikki Valens did it. She designed Arkham Horror and stuff like that, and some other things. gosh, I can't remember the name of it, I'm sorry. But there was a similar kind of mechanic there where you were like, okay, you're going to do this, and you kind of get the general idea how it's going to go based on who your character is or what the character you're interacting with is, but it's sort of like a fuzzy feeling. And that's kind of how it is in the dungeon. And I like that because it's more of a general, oh, okay, that kind of makes sense. It's like the DM sort of telling you, what's happened. It felt more like that. Whereas the mechanical sort of pinpointing of the monochrome one just kept taking me out of place. And the other thing about it is I kind of found the monochrome one sort of boring because I'm like, oh, corporate espionage, I don't care, I don't like companies. It's like, whatever, screw your stupid big company. Like, really? I mean, that's just sort of a personal thing. So, whoa, that bias just shot right through me, didn't it? Anyway, but yeah, so I'm like, it's just corporate espionage. Oh, that's super fun. That happens every day. Like, I was like, it's the real world. Ugh. So it had that kind of like weighing on me too. Sorry, but it's just like, I'm falling asleep based on the story. And then it also had that mechanical thing, which got me excited. I'm like, cool, there's an alarm, there's like pressure, that's going to be interesting. I like the heist idea because it's also kind of a heist idea. But like some of the characters that you like interact with in that monochrome one, I'm like, what wooden post of a person is this that I just talked to? Like, not really, like, what? It's so weird, the dialogue and everything. So, and I'm not trying to say that in a mean way, because it was designed by the same folks, so I think they were probably, work together on the story as well. But the dungeon one just felt more natural. You had sort of a classic, different types of people that you would interact with, and they were interesting as you move through the dungeon, and certain things that would happen. I'm trying not to spoil, but it was just like, oh, this person's kind of funny. This one they had personality to the characters in the dungeon one, whereas in the monochrome one, I was like, oh, what a brick to shoot him. I'm like, oh gosh, he's just like some evil person that works for a corporation. Just like end him, for God's sake, And but he can't do that, so I was like, I don't like this. So. That's a little fuzzy, but I kind of hope you get across. So maybe the monochrome one would be more interesting to you because like more of the spy espionage idea, and maybe some of the mechanical stuff I talked about in the walkthrough wouldn't bother you in the monochrome one. I think this is going to be very much up to kind of player taste in that case. But for me, you ask me, dungeon, take it or leave it. I would take the dungeon. I would leave Monochrome Inc. Now that being said, I'd be willing to give like Monochrome Inc. another shot with another group just to kind of see if it was a little different. But I wouldn't really be super looking forward to it. On the other hand, I would probably play the dungeon again. And this is the interesting thing about the game that I want to leave you with, is there's multiple endings, which is cool and then also like strange. But I also kind of think it's more on the cool side than the strange side, but maybe not by much. I'm not sure. So you finish the game, it'll tell you, okay, did X happen, and do you have this item, and do you do this? And you're like, okay, yes or no. And it says grab ending card 2 or grab ending card 3. And then you read that, and then I'll tell you to grab the ending scorecard. So you'll look, and then you add up your score, and you get some points or lose some points out of the ending card that you drew, and it gives you a little bit of a story wrap up, and maybe it wasn't as hot as you thought it would be, that kind of thing. So that's cool. And you're like, oh, and when we completed the dungeon one, I was like, oh yeah, but what if we went and did this? We never took care of this thing that was affecting this character, and we could have done that again, and we never even like figured out like any idea like how to solve that little random sort of side plot. And that would be really cool, but I think it was probably over here, but we were so carried away with like, solving this other little puzzle thing, and, but I'm like, wow, gosh, I think I would play it again to like try to get a higher score and a better ending. And I was like really surprised at that, because I'm like, well, I never want to play like an exit or anything again ever, although this is different, but I know some of the puzzles, like I'm just going to know how to solve it. I'm not going to go through the process of getting the clue and be like, oh no, just combine those and we know what that is. So I think you're going to lose a little bit of that, but it's also like there's still this other sort of, area that we didn't really get into in the dungeon one. So I think both of them score you by stars, yeah. So we got 3 stars out of 5 on the dungeon one. And I'm like, I know we could get up to 4. And we could figure out this other thing. And so that I know we could get like a different ending, because the ending was an ending, but it wasn't like the best ending and not in terms of quality, but in terms of like, you know, what our characters wanted. And that's the other thing. I'm sorry, the dungeon one, your characters were way more interesting too than in the monochrome one. Anyway, I don't want to digress too much. But, you know, we could have got like the best resolution for our characters as well. So I could kind of play it again, and then you could just say, well, I would know 75% of the puzzles. So would that be enough to get me to play it again? So I think actually it'd be weird, because if I play it again, I'm going to play it with a different group, I think. But then I kind of know some of the puzzles. So there's some real kind of conflict there for me in terms of like what you could do. So I can see folks, you know, if you're watching the video, I can see you wanting to play it again for sure. I don't think everybody's going to want to play again. I don't think some other people will. So it's like, I don't know. You have to take that for what you will. The cool thing is you can box it up, and you didn't destroy anything. So if you and a buddy played it, you give it to your other friends and they could play it the next day. So that's cool, because you're not destroying anything. You just pack everything back in order, easy to pack away. And then you could go through it again. And you could play it with a group, and then you kind of sit there and kind of act as the DM for a little while or something. And then once it gets to a spot you don't know about, maybe you could sort of break away. I don't know. But it's an interesting thing with the multiple endings and all that stuff. And I found myself sort of wanting to play the monochrome again, because we didn't really succeed at all. And it just did terrible. It just ended in like a nightmare. It was just a terror. I didn't like the game. And then the dungeon, which we did good at, you know, pretty good. And I was like, well, I still kind of want to play this one again too. So it's real interesting kind of dynamic there. Anyway, I definitely recommend getting the dungeon. I will be looking forward to playing future editions of the game. And, you know, maybe I'll like some and I won't like others. Which is different, because the exit games and the unlock games I've played, there's been some that I like more than others, 100%. But even the ones that are at the bottom of that list, I still liked. I still was like, that was cool. I had a good time. It was weird, different, and interesting, and, you know, it wasn't as good as the other one, but I still would like recommend people play it. Whereas this one, I was like, yeah, don't get monochrome. Although, you know, caveat, you might like it, but whatever. I hated it. But the dungeon one, yeah, recommend. So interesting stuff. Definitely a cool, interesting design. Kind of a next step or sideways step from some of the escape room games we have. A little bit more story-driven idea. So definitely take a look at the dungeon and the other one if it sounds good. But anyway, thanks.